The security footage from Hartwell Nuclear Generating Station, recorded on the night of November 14th, was reviewed by 3 separate engineers from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. All 3 submitted the same written conclusion. The footage had not been tampered with. The timestamps were unbroken. The cameras had functioned without interruption. And yet what that footage shows has never been given an official explanation. A man walking alone through an empty corridor on the graveyard shift, stopping, turning, and then, for 11 minutes and 43 seconds, moving slowly and deliberately in a way that the engineers described in their report as appearing to be a waltz, with no one there. Before we get to what the cameras recorded, and before we get to what Ray Patterson himself eventually told his supervisor on the last morning he ever clocked out of that plant, you need to understand who Ray was, and what he had already lost before any of this began. Raymond Patterson had worked at Hartwell Nuclear Generating Station for 26 years. He started when he was 32, fresh off a layoff from the steel mill in Allentown, with a pregnant wife, a second-hand truck, and a determination that bordered on stubbornness. He learned the plant the way a man learns a language out of survival. Every corridor, every access panel, every valve and switch and indicator light in every room of that facility, until the plant became something like a second body to him, something he knew from the inside. He worked maintenance. Night shift, mostly, because the differential pay was better, and because Ray Patterson was not a man who made decisions based on what was comfortable. He made decisions based on what kept the lights on at home. Home was a 2-bedroom house in Exeter Township with a small yard that Dorothy had turned into a garden so full of color every summer that neighbors slowed their cars to look. Dorothy, Dot, his wife of 31 years, a small woman with dark hair going silver and a laugh that Ray said could fix a bad day from across the house. She had a heart condition that had been with her for the last 8 years, managed with medications that cost more than they should, and visits to a cardiologist 40 miles away. Ray had taken a second job delivering parts on his days off. He had sold his fishing boat. He had quietly stopped buying coffee at the gas station and started making it at home. He did not tell Dot any of this. She would have told him to stop, so Ray worked nights and Dot slept, and the bills got paid, and the garden kept blooming, and they had been doing this quiet, careful dance for so long that Ray had almost stopped noticing how tired he was. Until the night of November 7th. The call came at 2 in the morning. Ray was doing his rounds in the secondary cooling building when his cell phone buzzed in his chest pocket. A Pennsylvania area code he recognized as Dot's cardiologist's emergency line. He answered it walking, and by the time the voice on the other end had finished speaking, he had stopped moving entirely. Dorothy Patterson had gone to bed at 10 that evening, the same as every night. She had taken her medications, as she always did. At 1:47 in the morning, her heart had simply stopped. Peacefully, the voice on the phone said, a word Ray would turn over in his mind for weeks afterward, trying to decide what it meant. He drove to the hospital. He sat with her. He held her hand for a long time in a room that smelled of antiseptic and quiet machinery. Then he drove home. He sat in the kitchen. He looked at her coffee cup still in the drying rack. Her reading glasses folded on the counter beside the stack of library books she had not finished. At 4:30 in the morning, he got back in the truck. He drove to Hartwell. He clocked in. His coworker Frank Kowalski was coming off shift when Ray came through the gate, and Frank stopped and said something that has been repeated in every account of this story since. Frank said, "Ray, what are you doing here? Go home." And Ray said, "There is nothing at home, Frank." There is just quiet. And he went inside. The first thing Ray noticed that was wrong happened on his third shift back, 3 days after the funeral. He was working alone in the corridor between the turbine building and the auxiliary systems room, running a routine check on a bank of pressure sensors, when he became aware of something behind him. Not a sound, not a movement, a sensation. The particular feeling of not being alone in a place where you are certain you are alone. Ray had worked night shifts long enough to know that large buildings develop personalities after midnight. Sounds travel strangely. Shadows pool in corners. He had learned not to give these things more weight than they deserved. But this was different from building noise. This was directional. Whatever he was sensing was behind him and slightly to his left, and it remained in exactly that position as he worked, as though something was standing at a specific point in the corridor and watching. He turned around. The corridor was empty. 200 feet of fluorescent-lit concrete, the indicator lights of the pressure array on the right wall, a fire extinguisher in its red cabinet at the far end. Nothing. He went back to work. 2 minutes later, the same sensation returned. Behind him, to the left. Close enough that the skin on the back of his neck tightened the way skin does when breath is near. Ray Patterson was not a man easily frightened. But that night, for the first time in 26 years at Hartwell, he finished his rounds in half the usual time and spent the last 2 hours of his shift in the break room with the lights fully on, sitting very still and watching the door. Whatever it was, it did not follow him there, but he knew with a certainty that had no explanation that it had stayed in that corridor waiting. The humming started the following week. Ray was alone in the sub-basement, checking a series of backup coolant flow meters that nobody had touched in 6 months. Sub-basement was the deepest accessible level of the plant, below the turbine floor, below the cable runs, a low silinged space of bare concrete and industrial piping, where the sound of the building was loudest and most constant, a low resonant vibration that Ray had always found oddly comforting after all these years. And beneath that vibration, threading through it from somewhere he could not locate, he heard a voice humming, not words, just a melody. Ray stood completely still, with his flashlight pointed at a coolant valve, and he listened. And the longer he listened, the colder the air around him became. And the colder it became, the more clearly he could hear the melody. And the more clearly he heard the melody, the more certain he became. Of something he desperately did not want to be certain of. He knew that song. It was a song called Blue Moon, an old song. Dot had hummed it constantly, doing dishes, tending the garden, walking down the hall in the evening. It had been so much a part of the texture of their life together that Ray had not consciously heard it in years, the way you stop consciously hearing the clock in your own kitchen. Now it was here, in sub-basement, at 3 in the morning, coming from a direction that, when Ray moved toward it, was always slightly further away than it appeared. He followed it for 11 minutes, through the low sailing space before he stopped himself. He stood in the dark for a moment, with his hand on a cold pipe. Then very quietly, to no one, to the empty basement, to the hum and vibration of the building around him, he said, "Dot, is that you?" The humming stopped instantly, and the air, which had become very cold, became slightly warmer. Ray did not sleep the next day. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at Dot's reading glasses on the counter, which he had not moved, and he thought about what it would mean if the answer to his question had been yes, and he thought about what it would mean if it had been no. Both possibilities frightened him equally. The access badge incident happened 10 days later and is the part of this story that has the most documentation. Ray arrived for his shift to find that his security badge had been used to access Corridor 7 of the Tertiary Systems building at 11:45 that evening, approximately 40 minutes before Ray himself had entered the plant. Corridor 7 required Level 3 clearance. Ray had Level 2, his badge, his number, his photograph on the system record. Used to open a door he did not have authorization to open 40 minutes before he arrived. Security reviewed the camera. The camera showed the badge reader activating. The door opening, no one passing through. The door closing, Ray was written up for a clearance violation he had not committed. He did not contest it because he did not know what explanation he would have given instead. What Ray did do that night after the meeting with his supervisor was go to Corridor 7 and walk its length slowly, running his hand along the wall, looking at everything. It was an unremarkable corridor. Electrical conduit, a row of communications relay boxes, a maintenance supply cabinet, and at the far end, in front of the supply cabinet, left on the floor with the deliberate placement of something set down by hands rather than dropped, was a single yellow rubber maintenance glove, Ray's glove. From a pair he had been missing for 3 weeks, he picked it up. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, quietly, to the empty corridor, "What are you trying to tell me?" The lights above him flickered once, then stayed on. Frank Kowalski asked Ray about it during their coffee break in the second week of December, 2 months after Dot had died. Frank was a careful man who did not say things he was not prepared to defend. And what he said to Ray, he said while looking at his coffee cup rather than at Ray's face, which was how Frank Kowalski handled things that made him uncomfortable. He said, "Ray, I have to ask you something and I need you not to take it the wrong way." Ray said, "All right." Frank said, "I was running cable in the break room last Tuesday, the window room, the one that looks into the main corridor, about 2 in the morning, and I saw you in the corridor, Ray. You were by the secondary coolant board." Ray said, "That sounds right," Frank said. "You were dancing." Ray said nothing. Frank said, "You were moving slow, like a waltz kind of thing, and your arms were up like you were holding someone. And you were smiling. I have not seen you smile since November." I did not say anything because I figured it was none of my business. And maybe you were just... I do not know. But then I looked at the camera log and there was nobody in that corridor but you. Ray looked at his coffee. After a long time he said, "I was not alone, Frank," Frank said. "The camera did not pick up anyone else," Ray said. "I know what the camera shows." Frank looked at him then, and what he saw in Ray's face made him decide not to ask anything else. What the camera could not show, and what Ray had not told anyone until his final conversation with his supervisor 7 months later, was what had happened that night in the corridor. He had been doing his rounds. It was close to 2 in the morning. The plant was running quietly, all systems normal, the night deep and still outside the high narrow windows, and then he smelled her perfume, not imagined, not remembered. Present, the actual physical scent of the specific perfume Dot had worn for as long as he had known her, a simple lilac scent from a bottle she'd bought at the drugstore every few months, filling the space around him in the main corridor of Hartwell Nuclear Generating Station at 2 in the morning. Ray stopped walking. He stood very still, and he felt, in the same way you feel the presence of someone standing close behind you in a dark room, that she was there, right there, within arm's reach. In the cold corridor air, in the humming quiet of the building, present in a way that did not require explanation and did not offer one. Ray Patterson, who had not cried since the hospital, felt his eyes fill. He said, very quietly, "Dot," and the air around him changed, warmed, and Ray, who had not danced in years, who had not had reason to dance, who had forgotten what it felt like to hold someone in his arms. Slowly, and without making a decision about it, raised his hands and danced for 11 minutes and 43 seconds. In an empty corridor under fluorescent light, Ray Patterson held what the camera could not see and moved slowly to a song only he could hear. When it ended, he stood still for a moment. Then he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and finished his rounds. He was smiling for the first time in 2 months. It was another 3 weeks before Ray understood the full shape of what Dot had been doing. He went back through his memory of the past months and began to see the pattern, the way you see a constellation, only when someone shows you the lines between the stars. The night he had been heading toward the equipment room, and something had stopped him cold, a sensation of absolute refusal, a wall of cold that had physically made him take a step back. He had been frustrated. He had gone the long way around. He had found out the next morning that a coolant line in that room had been venting a slow gas leak that the sensors had not yet flagged. The morning his coffee thermos had been moved from the locker room counter to the top of the cabinet, too high for him to reach without the step stool, which he almost never used. And on climbing the step stool, he had seen the thin crack running up the concrete wall behind the counter, the precursor to the section of wall that collapsed 4 days later, the glove in Corridor 7. He had needed that glove that very night for a job that required grip in a tight space, and he had spent an hour looking for it before giving up and doing the job barehanded and nearly slipping. She had not been haunting him. She had been watching him. She had been doing what she had always done, making sure he ate, making sure he slept, making sure he did not push himself past the point of his own stubbornness into damage he could not see coming. She had just found a new way to do it. Ray stopped being afraid the night he truly understood this. He started talking to her instead, quietly, during his rounds, the way he had always talked to Dot, while she sat in the kitchen and he worked on something at the table, not expecting answers in words, just keeping her in the room. He told her about Frank's retirement party and the terrible cake from the grocery store. He told her about the Hendersons' dog getting into her garden that spring and how he had fixed the fence himself and felt proud of it in a way that surprised him. He told her he had started watching the nature programs she had always watched, and he still did not understand why she liked them so much, but he had gotten through 4 episodes without falling asleep, which felt like progress. Sometimes the air around him warmed in a way that had no mechanical explanation. Sometimes the lights above him would gently and briefly brighten. Ray took these as answers. Ray Patterson worked at Hartwell for 6 more years after the night of November 7th. He stayed on night shift. His co-workers noticed that he never seemed lonely anymore in the way he had seemed those first weeks. The hollow, desperate quiet of a man with nothing to go home to. He seemed, if anything, looked after. He retired at 64, at his supervisor's insistence, citing a cardiac murmur that his doctor wanted monitored more carefully. On his last day, Frank Kowalski shook his hand and said, "You going to be all right, Ray, without this place?" And Ray looked at the plant, at the buildings he had spent 26 years learning from the inside, and he said, "I am not going to be alone, Frank. I have never been alone in this place. Not for a single night of it." He went home. He tended the garden. He finished Dot's library books. He sat in the evenings in the chair by the window where the light was good, and he talked to the room. On the night of March 3rd, 6 months after his retirement, Ray Patterson sat down in that chair by the window and closed his eyes. And for the first time in years, the house smelled of lilac. His heart which had been murmuring uncertainly for months, stopped the way Dot's heart had stopped, peacefully. The neighbor who checked on him the next morning said afterward that what she noticed first, before anything else, before she understood what had happened, was the expression on his face. She said she had never seen a man look that glad. There are things we do not have the mathematics for. Love is one of them. The particular love that grows quiet over 30 years, that does not announce itself loudly anymore, because it no longer needs to, that has become so woven into the structure of daily life that you cannot see it any more clearly than you can see the air you breathe. Ray Patterson was a maintenance worker at a nuclear power station in Pennsylvania. He was not a complicated man. He did not ask for miracles or grand gestures. He asked only to keep the lights on at home and to be near the person he loved. And whatever the universe is made of, whatever moves through the dark of old buildings in the deep of winter, whatever hums a song in a sub-basement at 3 in the morning and moves a glove to a corridor and warms the air in an empty hallway until a tired man raises his arms and remembers what it felt like to hold something precious. Whatever that is, it loved Ray Patterson back, and it waited for him. And when the time came, as it always does, in the quiet of an ordinary evening in March, with the light going gold through the window and the chair comfortable and the room smelling of lilac, he did not go alone. He never had.